Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, would you like to buy an executive jet from the Premier of Ontario? 10 years old, never actually used by the Premier, only $29 million. Yes, we're going to talk about the so-called gravy plane.
The opposition wants so-called surveillance pricing out of Ontario. So far, the government isn't biting.
Here's a question. Should we prevent foreign ownership of farmland so we can maintain food sovereignty in Ontario? We'll discuss that here because they're discussing that at the Ontario Legislature.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to look at the Ford government's penchant for secrecy.
And I've got more to say about the executive jet fiasco, starting with, doesn't anybody in the Premier's office know anything about Queen's Park history? We have seen this movie before, people.
It's Friday, April 24th, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little Stanley Cup playoffs sugar to get us started here.
Is there something happening in hockey?
Well, not in Toronto. Okay. So, yeah, you're probably wondering, why am I wearing this Maple Leafs jersey? The Leafs are out of the playoffs. I thought you might be wondering, so I'm going to put you out of your misery. 75 years ago this week, the greatest goal ever scored in the history of the century-plus-old Toronto Maple Leaf franchise was scored. It was scored by a guy named Bill Barilko, 24 years old. He won his fourth Stanley Cup in 5 years. The Leafs were a dynasty then, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
He scored the goal in overtime to win the Leafs the cup. Does that sound familiar? That's a lyric from the Tragically Hip song from the 1990s. Barilko goes on a fishing trip a few months after winning the cup. The plane goes down north of his hometown of Timmins for the biggest manhunt in Canadian history. They find nothing. 11 years later, by accident, they find the bodies. The Leafs had not won a cup in 11 years. In 62, they find the bodies. The Leafs win the cup.
Oh, wow.
It is an amazing, iconic Canadian and hockey story, and I'm doing a documentary on it. I'm directing a documentary on it for TVO. It's called Frozen in Time, and we're going to talk about this handsome Bash and Bill, they nickname him. He's a tough guy, 24-year-old Ukrainian kid who lost his life in the wilds of Northern Ontario 75 years ago, and the goal he scored was last Tuesday. The 75th anniversary of the greatest goal in Leaf history was last Tuesday. That's why I'm wearing, and let me stand up for those who, boy, that was a good-looking logo, wasn't it? What a beautiful jersey. Anyway, there you go.
Very nice. I have no such story to describe my T-shirt, which is here because of the extremely complicated and nuanced story of I found it in a thrift store and I really liked the look of it.
Well, we should describe it. It's the Canadian flag in the shape of Batman.
In the shape of the Batman insignia, yes. I'm old enough to remember the first Michael Keaton Batman film.
Oh, you're adorable. You say, you're old enough to remember the first Batman motion picture.
Hey, man, I just looked at the YouTube analytics. A lot of our listeners are not.
I'm old enough to remember the old TV series in the 1960s. Did you ever see that?
Oh, yeah. It was in reruns when I was a kid.
Adam West, Burt Ward?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a scream.
Yes.
Before we go on, we are, of course, going to do our three issues and our columns and our mailbag, but I want to talk about a former politician right now, and I'll hold off on the reason for now. We had a mayor in the city of Toronto from 1972 to 1978 named David Crombie, and he was part of a spirit of reform on that Toronto City Council. And he was a good mayor. And in fact, he was about 5'2". And so his nickname was, as you can imagine, the Tiny Perfect Mayor.
Yes.
He left in 78 to become a progressive conservative member of parliament for Rosedale. He won there. He had a very short stint in the Joe Clark government. It was over before you knew it. Opposition for 4 years. And then in 1983, first picture please, Sheldon, he ran for the leadership of the Federal Progressive Conservative Party. That's him on the right. That's former Deputy Premier Bob Welsh leaning over with the glasses on beside him. And he ran against Joe Clark, Brian Mulroney, John Crosbie. It was a great leadership convention, 4 ballots. And Mr. Crombie was out fairly early. He didn't have a great run. Brian Mulroney made a funny joke. Like, David Crombie's French was bad. And Brian Mulroney used to get up there and give his stump speeches and say, when I'm prime minister of this country and David Crombie is my minister in charge of Francophone affairs. Anyway, he had a good time on that. Mulroney obviously won the convention. A year later, he won the biggest majority ever. Mr. Crombie is 90 years old today. Yeah. And I wanted to acknowledge that because he has been at the center of every important political issue in this city for 6 decades. Yeah. And, you know, on the waterfront, on the Greenbelt, when the Toronto School Board can't figure out how to save its pools and keep them open, David Crombie is the guy they call. He's one of the finest politicians I've ever met. Let's put a picture up of him, if we could, Sheldon. More recent, this is a year ago. That's some of you, people of a certain generation, will remember Jackie Perrin, who used to be a news anchor on CTV. And there's David Crombie with a great smile. That's at a luncheon we had a year or so ago. And I want to wish him a happy birthday because he's 90 years old and still going gangbusters.
And, you know, he continues to be a voice, well, certainly when, for example, this current government has made changes to Greenbelt policy or conservation policy, land use planning policy that Mr. Crombie disagrees with. He has not been afraid to put his name to criticisms of this government.
He was the chair of the Greenbelt Council and resigned in protest over the Ford government's, whatever you want to call it, fiasco management of the thing.
Yes. You know, I don't know how many people there are in contemporary politics. There are a few that I could think of, but there are not many who command that kind of respect from really across the political spectrum, right? You would not, I mean, it was Kathleen Wynne who asked David Crombie to review her government's Greenbelt policies, right? You know, it would not be difficult for me to imagine Olivia Chow asking for his input on that kind of thing, right? Across the political spectrum, he does command that respect.
Because he's a legend.
Yes.
So legends command respect.
Yes.
Should we talk about the plane?
I guess we got it, don't we?
Off to issue 1. Okay, here's the story. The head of a $250 billion a year organization thinks he could be so much more efficient in the way he does his job if his employers bought him a plane. The job requires a lot of travel, and access to a plane would allow him to travel with much greater ease. Now, if that organization were a private corporation, this would not be a story. But the organization isn't a private corporation, it's the province of Ontario. And the executive in question is the Premier, who received an earful from many people who told him a $29 million executive jet was not an appropriate purchase. The Premier almost immediately backed down, announced he'd made a mistake, and would sell the jet. Doug Ford, earlier this week.
You know, there's no one in this country that is scrutinized more than I am. I'm willing to take that. What kind of really disturbs me is the inconsistency with the media. I guess there's a double standard, and that's my position. I have to take that.
Okay. Pick up the story. Where do you want to go?
So I want to talk a little bit about this, the apparent communications strategy, I guess, here, where the Premier is presenting himself as a victim. You heard him refer to the double standard of the media. I guess I will say, as a member of the media, nobody cares about our double standards. What people care about is the double standard the Premier is holding here, right? Like if any other Ontario Premier were proposing to buy themselves a $29 million jet, Doug Ford and the opposition benches would be raising hell about it. And I think that's kind of all we need to say about that. You know, when he says that he gets more media scrutiny than any other politician, well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. Justin Trudeau has been out of politics for a while now, and people are still writing stories about who he's dating. So
like, a little bit of scrutiny there.
Yeah. And some of the defenses have turned out not to be accurate, right? He said that, you know, the Quebec government bought a bunch of planes, a bunch of jets for themselves. CBC reported that, in fact, those jets are for medical use and not at the disposal of the Quebec Premier, the way this one would have been. I don't want to belabor this point, but he also in that press conference, you know, said, you know, he never expenses anything in his office. He did not begrudge other MPPs who need to. And then he very curiously claimed that he never brings this up. He never publicizes this. He had mentioned it at a press conference just the previous week. He has said it multiple times on camera.
It all the time. He does.
Congratulates himself quite a bit about this fact. So just to claim that he never publicizes it it's a really puzzling communications strategy, particularly when he has backed away from this. He's given this up. He clearly got an earful from voters, and perhaps members of his caucus were kind of surprised to learn about this. I don't know. But yeah, to make all of these claims when you are already retreating from it, it is mystifying to me.
The communications strategy, and I like the way you called it, the apparent communications strategy, because I see no strategy here whatsoever. But this could have been done. I mean, let's face it, there are a lot of people out there who would acknowledge that if you're running a $250 billion a year company and you've got to be traveling all over the place in a province that's the size of France and Germany put together, or France and Spain, I should say, France and Spain put together, it'd be very helpful to have a plane that could be more efficient the way you do your job.
Yes.
But that was never explained. There was no explanation advanced as to why this made sense. You need to lay the groundwork with some serious communications before you go and do something like this. One option could have been they could have gone and bought a $75 million plane. And if people raised hell, then they could have said, all right, fine, that's too much. So we'll just take the $29 million plane, and probably could have gotten away with that. He could have said, it's not for me, it's for my whole...
Sorry, I should, because I think we're going to get an earful. You would not be endorsing that strategy, but it would be a totally classic political maneuver.
Absolutely, correct. Well said. He could have said, we need this plane, and it's not just for me. Other people in my team will use it. It might get some medical use, like the Quebec situation there. We can be responsive to requests. I get invited to go to places all over this province all the time. A jet would really help. Although in most of Northern Ontario, the airports aren't big enough for a jet like that to land, but that's another story. The biggest problem for Doug Ford here is that this is just so off-brand. Mr. Ford has spent 8 years telling us that he's for the people. He has been telling us, well, and of course on his time on Toronto City Council before that as well, that he is not one of these elitists who, sips tea with his baby finger in the air.
Yes.
He's with the people, for the people. And you go out and you buy yourself an executive jet, and that's not exactly a for the people move.
No, and I do want to just take one moment to say, I don't think it's a healthy impulse in Canadian politics for people to have a sort of a no, our politicians can't have nice things reaction. When you indulge in that too easily, you get the situation we have federally with, sorry, I always forget the actual address, 24 Sussex?
Yes.
The Prime Minister's official residence, which is currently abandoned
vacant
and dilapidated.
Yes.
And we should be able to spend money so that the Prime Minister of our country has it doesn't need to be the world's most opulent mansion, but it should not be falling apart.
Correct.
and so I do want to push back against the most sort of knee-jerk impulse and say that, and I said this in what I wrote for the website this week, that, I'm open to the argument that, as we say, the chief executive of a $200 billion organization might in fact need that jet. But to go back to the apparent communication strategy, let's just review the facts here. This was revealed to the public on a Friday in the Toronto Star. The government announced it was bailing on the Sunday. So 3 days. I cannot prove this. And I want to be clear about this. Maybe I shouldn't speculate on TVO's airwaves. But,
go ahead.
You and I both know that's about how long it takes to get reliable polling data, right? 2-3 days is about how long it takes to get data you can trust out of a poll. The evidence before us is compatible with the hypothesis that they made this public on Friday and they wanted to get the public opinion information. They got it on Sunday and knew that this was absolutely not going to fly, that it was going to be politically toxic, and they bailed. The other thing that I want to mention here, because it is kind of funny for those of us who have a bit of a longer memory, this week Government House Leader Steve Clark, in defending the decision to back away from this plane purchase, and I don't think we've actually established the Premier has said this week that Bombardier has bought the plane back from the Ontario government for the same sum that we paid for it. So
what a coinky-dink.
Yeah. Nice to have friends. But so taxpayers are not on the hook for any of this. But Steve Clark said, and I quote, "It's never too late to do the right thing."
Now, where have I heard that quote before?
Now, you might have heard it from a former Premier, Dalton McGuinty, who used those exact words when his government was under fire for not building the gas-fired power plants in Oakville and Mississauga. 2 points to make on this. One, the talking point did not work. It's not like the opposition parties all said, oh, well, when you put it like that, I guess there's no problem here, right? They continued to attack the Liberals over that decision for many years afterwards. The other thing that I want to point out here is that, Cabinet approved this purchase, right? They had to, both sort of the political principle, and I think just the political reality of it is that means like everybody is on the hook for this decision politically. Every time a minister going forward has to make a tough decision about where to spend money and, more importantly, where not to spend money, voters are going to be within their rights to say, well, wait a second, like you don't have money for my community center, my hospital, my kid's school, but you had $30 million or $29 million for a jet for the premier. That is exactly the comparison that was so toxic for the Liberals for so long, which, that the $1 billion gas plants, right? Even when people didn't necessarily understand all of the details of power plant regulation and how those costs are reflected in electricity bills, they knew that $1 billion price tag. They understood, and it stood in as a shorthand for this government is spending money on cynical political priorities and not on the things that we in the public need. So
there are actually two more things to say about this story.
Sure.
Which we will save for our columns later, because I touched on those two other things in our columns. You got anything else on this?
One other quick thing I will just say, the Global News had a good story this week looking at some of the reaction within the PC party. One PC MPP was quoted as saying that this would be the beginning of the Premier's undoing. And, I'm not sure I would go that far. But frankly, somebody who's won elections probably knows more about this than I do. But I would advise the Premier to take that kind of talk seriously when the phone call is coming from inside the House,
The phone call is coming from inside the House. Good one. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. If you've followed politics over the past year, you'll know that the new Democratic Party, both federally and provincially, has had a tough time getting traction on a wide variety of issues. The result has been a near wipeout federally and a party that got only 18% of the votes in the last provincial election. But the NDP thinks it's now hit on a big and growing concern. It's something called surveillance pricing. And before we go on, I should add that I have a family member who works for the minister who is carrying this file on surveillance pricing, so I put that out there in the interest of full disclosure. Now that that's out of the way, JMM, why don't we start by just having you tell us what surveillance pricing is?
Right. So if you haven't heard of this term before, it's going around, it's becoming more prominent, but it's entirely possible you haven't heard this term before. The idea here is that, and we're primarily at this point talking about online retailers, though that might change. I'll get into that in a moment. And the idea here is that a company like Amazon or Google or whoever, they have collected so much data from your phone, from your browsing history, from the whole trail of breadcrumbs you leave on the internet as you just do normal things in the world, that they know really an extraordinary amount about you and your life. And they are able to use that information to price things differentially. So, if you go shopping for something on Amazon, say you need a USB charger, Amazon is going to know things about you and me, and they could very well say, well, you know what, we're going to charge Steve $32, but we're going to charge John Michael $30. And we're usually talking about small margins, but the idea is that, frankly, people are getting charged unfairly based on things that they don't control. The FTC in the US has looked at this and found that firms using these methods, and it is being used. This is not like an entirely hypothetical scenario. The FTC in the US, sorry, that's the Federal Trade Commission, a body that is one of the consumer protection bodies. They have looked at this and found that these methods can increase the profits for a firm anywhere between 1% and 5%.
So that doesn't sound like a big number, but then of course multiplied by tens of millions of purchases, and pretty soon you're talking real money.
Yeah, exactly. And even on a household level, paying an extra 2 to 3% on your groceries throughout the year, that can add up pretty quickly, right? So for now, we really are talking about, algorithmic pricing, surveillance pricing. These are different names for the same thing. Primarily talking about online retailers, but there is some concern that this could make its way into the brick and mortar world, right? If you've ever seen a store with digital price tags on the shelves, the concern is that literally, you walk down the cereal aisle and it'll say one price for Cheerios, or, insert your preferred cereal here. And then, a few minutes later, I walk down the same cereal aisle and it shows me a different price, right? These are the kinds of concerns, and consumer advocates obviously think this is basically a form of exploitation.
How did this issue make its way to Queen's Park?
Right. So NDP leader Marit Stiles last week introduced a opposition day motion urging the government to prohibit exactly this practice. She was following the lead of fellow New Democrat and Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew. Manitoba has introduced legislation to prohibit this as a business practice, both online and in physical stores. That bill is currently before the Manitoba legislature. Last I checked, it is at the second reading stage. The Liberals, for what it's worth, also introduced a private member's bill that would also prohibit surveillance pricing. And we actually asked Green Party leader Mike Schreiner about this last week when he was on the show. I think we had to cut that bit for time, but he also said he opposes these kinds of tactics by businesses, and believes that they are anti-market in a more fundamental way. So I say all that just to say the opposition parties are all in agreement here that they oppose surveillance pricing and would like to see it prohibited in Ontario. The government, however, disagrees. And the Premier has said last week that he believes that competition between grocers is the best way to assure low prices.
Well, having said that, the NDP thinks they've got a political winner on their hands here, and they are going to the wall on this issue. They've made a YouTube video. They've really decided to put some resources into getting the word out on this. How's it working?
This is actually part of an interesting shift that we've seen from the NDP in the last few months. Folks will remember, of course, that Stiles survived a leadership review vote after the 2025 election, but it was not the comfortable margin that she would have preferred. And one of the things she did to show NDP supporters that she's taking that verdict seriously is that she's changed up her team inside her office, and also seems to have really doubled down on a new digital communication strategy. It occurs to me that both our first and second segments, we've really emphasized communication strategy from different people. But hey, communications is an important part of politics. The new digital comms strategy is explicitly modeled on Zoran Mamdani's very successful election campaign from last year in New York City. That is not me speculating or hypothesizing about that. One of the YouTube videos from last year is literally titled, "If you think this looks like a Zoran Mamdani fundraising video, you'd be right." It's nice when they spell it out for the slow kids in the class like me. And, the video that her party put up last week about surveillance pricing, really setting the stage for their opposition day debate, I think is very much part of that strategy. It is a very a punchy, well-produced, snappy video that is informative. It obviously, it's still partisan political communication. I would not want anybody to think that this is a business seminar on, pricing strategies among large retail firms. It is very clearly out to make a political point, but it does so very well and in the style that we've seen used very successfully by, as I say, the Mamdani campaign, but also by other organizations in the U.S. I mean, it very explicitly cites a group called More Perfect Union, which is, as the name implies, a sort of pro-labor, pro-consumer organization that has also led the charge in the U.S. against so-called surveillance pricing.
Should we take a peek at some of it?
Yeah, we've got a clip, absolutely.
Let's do it. Roll tape.
I'm introducing a motion to ban predatory pricing in Ontario. Doug Ford should put his money where his mouth is and protect you from the American tech giants and corporations that are ripping you off.
So there are, two questions that we are not going to know the answer to for a while, though. The first, I think, is whether this helps bring the NDP out of third place, which is where they are currently in the polls. They are behind the Liberals, who are in turn behind the Progressive Conservatives still. And the second question is whether this, in fact, does quiet some of the internal criticism that Stiles faced and that caused her to make those changes in her office. On that front, I think we're seeing some earlier signs that the party is appreciating a more punchier comm strategy, if I could put it that way, punchy in multiple senses of the word. We are going to have to wait and see a little bit. Of course, we are presumably a few years from the next election. So everybody has time to sort of plant seeds and see what grows.
Presumably and apparently. Because one never knows.
Yes,
one never knows.
Not anymore.
No, that is true. Okay, let's get off to issue 3. There are some industries in Canada that are not allowed to be owned by foreigners. Legacy television stations, for example. Fox or CNN would not be allowed to buy CBC, CTV, or TVO. What about farmland? Well, apparently the province thinks that also needs protection from foreign ownership, and the government has moved to do just that. Details, please, JMM.
Right. On Wednesday, Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness Minister Trevor Jones introduced Bill 109, the Protecting Ontario's Food Independence Act. The bill is going to give the government the power to regulate the ownership of farmland in Ontario. And it's kind of a curious case. This is another one of these cases where, as usual, we received a technical briefing from the government, and they don't actually know how serious a problem this is. We were asking for, like how many farms in Ontario are owned by non-Canadian, non-residents. And they just don't know. They know the answer is greater than 0. They have some data from collecting the land transfer tax, of all things, that tells them, okay, like some money is clearly changing hands in a way that is like, it's showing the government that some farmland is owned by non-Canadians, but they were very clear that they just do not have good data on this. And that is part of what this legislation is intended to address. For starters, it will allow the government to collect the data that they want. And this is part of a consultation process that will begin about, what to do about this issue.
You always assume that when a government introduces a bill, they're trying to solve a problem. This is a bill that has been introduced,
yes,
and we don't really know if the issue is a problem, right? We just don't. We don't know we don't know what percentage of land is foreign owned, what percentage of farmland.
No, and I mean, this is frankly an old story. I mean, folks might remember back I'd say the middle of the last decade, there was a great deal of concern in Ontario about foreign ownership of like residential properties, right? The idea being that, condos were being built, but nobody was actually living in them. They were just being held by foreign investors. And that was part of the motivation for introducing the non-resident speculation tax that the Wynne government introduced and the Ford government has expanded, which was in part to address this, in part to like directly address this question of, are foreigners buying up homes that we need and presumably want to see occupied, and are they just leaving them unoccupied? That was one issue. But also, the government just did not know what the scale of the problem was. And so, say what you will, but like taxing these kinds of things is one way to collect the information. The government is very motivated to collect that money, and that's how they get information.
The money and the information. Yeah. Is there any indication that this bill would require land owned by foreigners to be sold? Like, would it force a sale of land owned by foreigners?
So the government says no. Their current thinking is basically that in a case where farmland is owned by a non-Canadian, that the status quo would prevail. They would not send in jackbooted thugs to force them to sell the land or anything like that. But when it came time for that land to be sold, in theory, the law would require them to sell it only to a Canadian. They would not be allowed to sell it to another non-Canadian or non-resident. I'm speaking in generalities here because, and the government is saying, they don't have a clear regulatory framework in mind just yet. This is all part of a process that they are going to start, and introducing this legislation is the beginning of that process.
Anything else?
Yes. And if I'm honest, this is actually the bit of this week's agricultural news that I personally find most interesting. But before I start, Steve, do you know what the clay belt of northeastern Ontario is?
The clay belt of northeastern Ontario.
Yes.
John Michael, I've lived in this province for 64 years. I have been to every corner of this province. It has been part of my job to be all over Ontario and know these things. So the answer is no. I do not. No, I actually don't. I've never heard it before.
So this is a vast swath of land in northeastern Ontario. The geological or geographical feature actually spans the Ontario-Quebec border. I believe we have a map that we're going to put up here. Yes, if you're watching on YouTube or on TV, you'll see it there. The size of it really needs to be emphasized here. There's also a lesser clay belt further south. Between the two of them, they actually hold more arable land than we have in southern Ontario. This is going to come off as an insult, but it is generally regarded as lower quality. This is there's a scientific classification for farmland. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just saying I'm not dumping on Northern Ontario. I'm just saying it is not the Class A farmland of Southern Ontario, but it's a truly massive amount of farmland. And along with those foreign ownership changes that were announced in Bill 109, the government has announced this week that they are going to consult on ways to allow farming uses on Crown lands in the clay belt. Now, that might mean selling Crown land. That might mean long-term leases to people who want to use it for farming. But the idea is to encourage the growth of agriculture in the province's north, where, thanks to climate change, different crops are now easier and more profitable to grow. Once upon a time, you could only really grow wheat and oats in the clay belt, and these days corn and soy are more amenable up there. This has also been a long-term effort by Ontario's beef farmers to get more cattle grown up in the north. That's been going on for many years. And I do want to say from the outset here that disposing of Crown land is not a politically straightforward issue. There's always sort of questions about, if you sell land, you never really get that back. You also, of course, when we're talking about Northern Ontario, you certainly want to consult with Indigenous people about how we dispose of that Crown land. So again, the start of a process, but a very interesting one to me.
Now, as coincidence would have it, last weekend in a place called Vineland Station, which is, I guess, about 40 minutes east of Hamilton on the southern side of Lake Ontario, I did an episode of TVO Today Live with about 30 plus leaders in the agriculture and agri-food sector from around Ontario. And a pretty good show. It'll be on, I think, April 30th. It's going to be on TVO. So those are my bona fides on agriculture. Unless you're doing some farming in Beaches, East York that I'm unaware of, why does this story have so much fascination for you?
So I love the history of the clay belt, right? For more than a century, Ontario policymakers have been trying to settle farmers in the clay belt, right? When the first railways came into the region, the railways of the day tried to market the land there, and they would publish these pamphlets in Toronto saying, move to Timmins. It's not that much colder than Toronto. I think today we would call that fraud, but after World War I, the province thought, we had all these returning soldiers from the war, and the cities were growing rapidly, but were still seen as too crowded and choked with people. So, we'll just settle these returning soldiers in the north. That did not go very well. It was largely considered to be a failure. I think it did not even last 5 years. At the same time, I mentioned that the clay belt spans both Ontario and Quebec. The Quebec side of the clay belt is regarded, certainly by Ontario policymakers, as being much more settled, much more developed for agriculture, a different set of policies there. And so we've literally been told that Ontario policymakers are looking at the Quebec example and thinking what did they do differently that got such different results, literally just on one side of an imaginary line between Ontario and Quebec. I will just add one other sort of personal note. This was literally the subject of the first thing I ever wrote for TVO's website 12 years ago.
Oh,
so
there we go.
I like to bring it up when I can, because I have been watching this file on and off for more than a decade.
I think you're secretly farming in Beaches, East York. That's what I think is actually going on here.
If you'd ever seen my backyard, you would understand how minimal that effort could possibly be.
Shall we talk about our columns?
Let's do it.
Your column, my column is next. Time now for our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I have a little chit-chat here at the table about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, over the past week. Go to tvo.org, see us, click on it. Bingo, there they are. What did you write this week you want to talk about?
Well, you and I both had more to say about the jet issue. And so I wrote a piece that said more about the jet than just this. But one point I want to reiterate is that, this was a decision made in secret. Governments make lots of decisions in secret. That's not new. But in this case, I think it is part of the explanation for how the government got into trouble, right? We talked about this earlier, right? If you had done the work to prepare the ground and had any kind of communication strategy to say, like, to justify the purchase before you announced it to the people of Ontario, this might have gone over more smoothly. And, maybe it wouldn't have, but it was clearly Plan A did not work. And my point here is that the secrecy is a part of some other failures that this government has had, right? We could talk about the Greenbelt fiasco. We could talk about the 2019 budget, where out of nowhere they announced the in-year retroactive cuts to transfer payments to things like municipalities and public health agencies, with no prior communications that this stuff was coming. Secrecy, insularity, these things are bad for governments just on their own terms. I don't think that the Tories are quite happy with the last week or so of events.
You think?
By the time this goes to air, I think the government will have made it more secretive, right? They have passed a motion in the legislature to rush the budget measures bill through the legislature. It will not go to committee. The budget measure bill includes the changes to freedom of information laws that we talked about previously on this podcast. It's going to make it much harder to access information from the government of Ontario. It was already, frankly, not great. And I end that column by asking progressive conservatives to consider whether more secrecy, more insularity is really the thing that they want to lean into right now based on recent results.
Do you know what song I couldn't get out of my head all weekend long?
What's that?
Leaving on a jet plane, don't know when I'll be back again. This purchase of this jet. Look, I'm not even going to get into the argument whether the Premier needs it or doesn't, or should have it or shouldn't have it. That's for others to decide. What I thought I could write about was the notion that, folks, we have seen this movie before. If you go back 45 years, Premier Bill Davis purchased a Challenger jet for $10 million. And almost immediately, the public rose up in anger. There was the same kind of reaction that we saw, what we heard a lot of this time. The opposition parties, they just had their teeth all over this week after week after week after week. The Premier's principal secretary, who was a guy by the name of John Tory, did some polling and went back to the Premier and said, the public hates this plane. Right. You have to sell it. And he did. And he eventually traded it in for a couple of water bombers, which would then go out and fight fires across the province of Ontario. I asked Erin Kelly from Advanced Symbolics, Inc., the artificial intelligence polling outfit, if she would mind just sort of doing a quick and dirty, go into the field and see what people are saying about this. And what she came back with absolutely fascinated me. She said the public was running about 50-50 for and against the plane. Right. Some people understood that if you're running a $250 billion a year corporation, it'd be good to have a plane. Yeah. Other people were absolutely outraged by it, thought it was off-brand, et cetera, et cetera. But Erin's conclusion was it was dissipating. And if the Premier had simply stuck to his guns for a few more days, the issue, in her view, looked like, in terms of public opinion, it was going away. Right. And he probably could have got away with it. But he didn't. They kind of, what do you want to say, panicked and sold the thing anyway. But I come to the conclusion that if anybody if anybody in the office of the Premier of Ontario, and there are a lot of people who work in that office,
Yes.
if any of them had any knowledge at all about Queen's Park history, going back 45 years, seeing that this thing happened, the same damn thing happened 4.5 decades ago. The outcome was the same. The poor strategizing for how you would sell the public on the need for it. There's something about this issue. Like, people just don't want the Premier to have a plane.
Yeah.
And, or a lot of them don't anyway, and get very passionate about it. And that's what my column's about.
As we're speaking here, the other example that comes to mind, you don't even have to be a student of history, although that I'm a big fan of history. Let's just talk about the return of MPP pensions and the salary increase, right? How was that done? Like, yeah, this is a contentious issue, and nobody wanted to be the Premier who gave MPPs a raise for, it was almost 20 years,
Yeah.
It was 15 years. And it eventually passed, bringing the parties together, and they all basically agreed to mutual disarmament, if I can put it that way.
We're
right?
not going to politicize this.
And it was just like quick, like 3 votes in the legislature on the same day, bang, bang, bang. And maybe you couldn't have actually done that with the jet thing, but that would be one path to do it, right? And I know I've just railed against secrecy, but if we're talking about the politics of it, right, bring the opposition in early. Say, look, the Premier is legitimately flying all over Canada to U.S. markets, trying to drum up business. We think this is necessary. Can we rely on you guys to support this and not try and hang us on it? And again, clearly not something they did, but it worked for bringing back pensions and increasing MPP salaries. It is at least hypothetically a method that could have worked here.
Can I tell you a cute story about this?
Yes.
Let's go back to 2009.
Right.
Jim Bradley is the MPP for St. Catharines. He is in the cabinet of Dalton McGuinty. Yep. He decides to write Bill Davis a note. Former Premier Davis, who served from 71 to 85 as Premier and who had to do a big volte-face on the buying of the jet back in 1981. He wants to wish him a happy 80th birthday. So he sends him a letter and wishes him a happy 80th birthday. Mr. Davis writes Mr. Bradley back and says, "Every time I hear from you, it makes me wonder whether or not you have second thoughts about hounding me to my, to the edges of the earth to get rid of the jet."
Yes.
Because, of course, now Bradley was in government.
Yes.
And there was a moment when David Peterson, who was the Premier in the late 80s, and Jim Bradley were leaving some kind of federal provincial conference or something. And they got to the airport, and there's Quebec with its Premier's jet, and there's BC with their Premier's jet. And Peterson and Bradley got on some puddle jumper and said, "Look, what am I doing in this rinky-dink plane?" If they bought the plane, yes, Doug Ford would have been advantaged by it.
Yes.
But he's not going to be in power forever.
Yes.
And the other party is eventually going to get back in.
Yes.
I mean, it will happen. And they would get to use the jet.
Yes.
And then this issue would go away.
Yes.
But we're not there yet.
No, we are not.
Let's go to the mailbag.
Absolutely. So this week's mailbag item comes from KK in Kingston, and it is about the Alto high-speed rail public consultation. KK writes, "Hello, Steve and JMN. Since the Alto public consultation ends Friday, April 24th, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the viability of this project. I want to be excited for the project, but facing the potential of no access to the service in our region while also dealing with a train potentially cutting through my grandparents' farmland and community makes me upset. Do you think there is still a case to be made for high-frequency rail instead of high-speed rail? Building upon existing infrastructure seems a lot less challenging than contending with building a rail line in the aptly named Land O'Lakes. Thanks for all you do. Big fan of the podcast. KK, the conflicted Kingstonian."
KK, because we covered this story, I am not going to offer an opinion on whether they should or they shouldn't, but I will simply observe they haven't.
Right.
This idea has been around since the 1950s.
Yeah.
Every government in its day comes forward with a proposal to build in that corridor from Windsor to Quebec City, which is obviously, the majority of the population of the country is in that corridor, and some kind of either high frequency or high speed rail has been proposed over and over and over, and it's never happened.
Yeah.
And it's never happened because financially it's really, experts say, not viable. You will, as government, have to subsidize the heck out of this thing to make it happen. Now, we seem to have a government in power right now, and the previous one was also there, and through this Alto group that seems prepared to at least consider the idea of what it would take to get this thing built. But we're still a long way away.
Yeah, and I think it's a mark of how, frankly, how depressing it can be to consider large civil works projects in Canada, that even with the pretty extraordinary legislation that the Carney government has passed that mirrors the Bill 5 that Doug Ford's government passed after the last election, even with these extraordinary powers to approve precisely projects like this, the Carney government's estimate is that they might begin construction in 5 years on the high-speed rail project. KK asks, do we have thoughts on the viability of this? And I have some thoughts. I think one question that I still don't think we've seen a satisfactory answer to is that there is kind of a political direction to the route of the high-speed train. The then Trudeau government more or less set in stone that it has to go through Peterborough and it has to take a more sort of northern route. KK is from Kingston. Alto is saying that they will not have a stop in Kingston. The route will not. It will simply not go through that part of the province. And so there are, frankly, reasonable questions to ask about, like, is this the most sensible route for a train to take? If we're talking about maximizing ridership, which is one of our goals, I would think. The other issue that KK mentions is the contrast between high-speed rail and high-frequency rail.
Yes.
And just a brief refresher here, the distinction here is, like, high-speed rail, you kind of need to build new tracks almost from scratch, and they have to be on, like, very, very straight route for a train to be able to get up to the speeds that we talk about when we talk about high-speed rail.
It's like 250 or 300 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, like, you can't do a hard turn when you're going that fast.
No.
Whereas high-frequency rail, and this was championed by VIA back starting with the Harper government, and had at least seemed to be supported by the Trudeau government for many years. That idea really relies more on conventional tracks, and you can still get trains faster than your conventional VIA train goes these days, but really what you're emphasizing is more trains running more frequently and delivering a higher level of service that way. This was exactly the debate also that the Wynne government faced several years ago. People may recall that the Wynne government was also proposing to build a high-speed rail line from Toronto to Windsor. I guess Windsor eventually, but they were really talking about Toronto to London. We had the same basic sort of political debate of, do you build these new train lines through, in some cases you've got to cut through new farmers' field, or the new tracks have to cut through farmers' fields, or go new routes through towns that frankly do not necessarily welcome these trains. The nature of a high-speed rail line is that there are fewer stops, so you have lots of communities that are going to see the train pass right through them, but are not really going to benefit.
Not at all.
I also wrote about this for TVO a while back. It is genuinely a political dilemma for governments that want to do these things. The nature of transportation planning in Canada seems to be that we often find ourselves having to say things like, if it's the choice between this high-speed rail project and no high-speed rail, I guess I support this one. As I say, I have some reservations about, like, the choice of the route, that kind of thing. I certainly don't envy people who live in Eastern Ontario and are seeing some of the disruption that this could cause.
Well, two more quick points. Number one, we should say Pierre Poilievre, the opposition leader in Ottawa, is on the record as saying he would cancel this and save $90 billion in his view.
Yes.
So that's point one. Point two, I read an interesting column by David Olive in the Toronto Star a few days ago. David says national unity is a problem right now.
Yeah.
And we're talking about putting massive billions of dollars into something that will only help people, in Ontario and Quebec.
Yes.
And his idea was, how about building one from Edmonton to Calgary? Because the West would presumably love it.
Yep.
It would be cheaper, and you'd do a pretty big solid for those folks who are talking about independence in Alberta right now. So that's another idea to keep in the back burner.
Yeah, I am not an expert in Alberta politics, and I don't want to get too far over my skis on this one. My impression was that the current government of Alberta is not super enthusiastic about trains, but if they're willing to be on board, then I would say go for it.
Why don't we give the email address and we'll get out of here?
Absolutely. As always, if you've got questions about the content on our show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, April 24th, 2026. Once again, happy 90th birthday to former Toronto Mayor and Federal Cabinet Minister David Crombie.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name, or I guess 2 initials will work if you're KK from Kingston and conflicted, and where you're located as well, please.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. Stacey Dunseith is acting vice president, programming and content.
We always like to thank the crew for setting up the studio here to make the YouTube and video portion of this podcast happen. So thanks a lot, gang. And until next Friday, everyone, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.